Hello, and thanks for joining us. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar, Dealing with Declining Demand and Decreasing Customers. My name is Tess Clark. I work here at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center, and we have a fantastic program today that we will get to in just a minute. But first, there are a few logistics and housekeeping items that we need to cover. So first, everyone will be kept on mute just to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, just type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. All of the questions will be reserved for a Q&A at the end, but please feel free to send questions at any time. We will be posting the presentations from today as well as a video recording on our website. You can reach that website at www.efcnetwork.org. All of our webinars can be found under the Past Events tab. We will also post a recording of today's webinar and presentation slides as soon as we can after the broadcast, and we will send you a link to those materials in a follow-up email in just a few days. I see that we are getting questions already about getting the webinar materials, so just don't worry, we will send those out as soon as we can. We do not submit our webinars to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits. However, we do send certificates of attendance as a courtesy. If you have joined this webinar with the intention of using it to support PDH or CEU hours, please know that we can only supply certificates after we verify attendance. It can take 1 to 2 weeks to send out certificates, and you must attend the entire webinar to receive one. You must join the webinar using the unique join link that you received when you registered, and you must be viewing the slides and listening to audio. Again, we can't guarantee that this webinar will meet the requirements for specific CEU or license renewal needs. If you have other questions about this, you can email us at smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories to help local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And as you might guess, the EFCN is a university-based network. You can see a list of all of our network members here. We work together to create solutions to difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental protection and improvement. On that note, I'd like to introduce Shadi Eskoff from the University of North Carolina. Shadi is the Research Director for the UNC Environmental Finance Center. Shadi Eskoff joined the Environmental Finance Center in 2004 and has worked on environmental finance projects related to water rate setting, water capital needs and funding, utility finance, and has done all of this on the local, state, and national level. So welcome, Shadi. I'm going to send the screen sharing capability to you.
Thank you very much, Tess. And thank you, everybody, for joining us in today's webinar. I should be sharing my screens right now. So we're going to be talking about dealing with declining water demand and decreasing customers. And the reason why we put this webinar together is because we were working with some communities. We do a lot of direct assistance with small water systems, and we were working with a group of small systems, and we were looking at the trends in their populations and their water usage, and we saw significant declines, and they were having a really hard time dealing with the financial implications of that. So we helped them, and we figured that we could put together a webinar to address this question, because it's not just them that are dealing with this issue, but other small systems as well. So as part of the agenda for today's webinar, I'd like to demonstrate some of the extent to which the water systems in the US are seeing declines in population demand, just to talk about what the scale of the problem might be, and then to talk about the effects of those decreases on the finances. So my focus is really going to be on the financial implications, not so much on the water quantity or water quality aspects, but on the financial management of water systems, and presenting strategies to mitigate those financial risks. So what do you need to do in order to protect your finances against declining demands and declining customers or decreasing customers? And we'll talk both about financial strategies as well as other types of strategies, managerial or process or structural type strategies as well. And I won't be able to get too deep into any of these strategies. I'll be talking about several strategies. So it'll be kind of a shallow look at a breadth of options, but I'm always happy to work directly one-on-one with each system, or have some of my colleagues work with systems in dealing with their own issues and looking more in depth into any one of these particular strategies. The topics seem to resonate with a lot of people across the country. This is a map of what the water systems that were registered as of last week. And you can see that it's in practically every state. And we also have some from Canada and Puerto Rico and other places as well. So thank you all for joining. All right, so let's talk about the trends in population and water demand for water systems. Total population in the US is growing. It's been growing at about 0.5% per year. So why are we even discussing decreasing customers or declining demands when we know that the US keeps having more and more people, and on the whole, we're treating more water and we're delivering water to more customers across the United States. Well, even though population is growing nationally on the whole, at the local level, a lot of communities are seeing decreasing population. So it's skewed. There's some places where you see decreases and some places you see increases. And we're looking at the census places, which is basically all the cities and towns and villages across the country. About 43% of the cities and towns and census places saw a decline in population between 2010 and 2017. So that actually startled me to see that not many numbers of systems, a number of communities, excuse me, that have seen a decline in population. And some of them significant declines as well. When we're talking about 31% had declined more than 3.5% over that 7-year period. Declining populations in some towns and cities means that it's also declining number of customers. We know that the city population is not the same thing as water system service population, but in general, a lot of small systems serve one community or areas around one particular community. So we do see a lot of systems with declining populations. This graph is actually looking at the number of active water accounts coming from the billing records of the water system that we were helping. And you can see that trend from 2002 all the way to 2017 was a decrease in population. And what you don't see in this graph is that there was actually a significant drop even after 2017. But just to show you the trend, kind of a slow decrease in population over time for this one particular system, but we've seen that also happen in a lot of other small systems across the country. And the rate also, you can see that was decreasing by anywhere between 3% per year and 0.6% per year. Looking at you all, registrants, and looking at the cities that you are living in, not necessarily the systems that you are or who you serve, but just the city that you happen to be living in or be working in, you can see a lot of red dots here. And the red dots here are towns and cities of the registrants of this webinar, where you've seen a decline in population from 2010. So you're amongst those 43% of census places that have seen declines since 2010. If we take out the larger systems, larger cities, because there are a lot of people here who registered are from state capitals or just big cities, you're working for state agencies. If we take out the large cities and just focus on cities that have a population of 10,000 or fewer, you can see there's a greater proportion of the smaller cities that have declining populations. And this is something that's not just unique to the registrants of this webinar, but nationally that's what we're seeing. So overall, 47% of the census places that had fewer than 10,000 population, 47% have seen a decline in population since 2010. Compare that to 24% of census places that had population of greater than 10,000. So 47% for small towns, 24% for large towns. And that was statistically significant. So that's something that we're seeing. It's a common trend among small systems, small cities in particular. In addition to declining populations in some cities, you're also seeing overall a decline in water use average for residential customers. So even though number of people are growing as a nation, in some places you see that decreasing, just average residential water use, average total water use for public water supply systems is decreasing and has been decreasing since about 1995, 2000, and more rapidly in the last few years as well. And the more and more we look at these billing records for other systems, the more we notice that there's a majority of systems that are seeing the average water use is declining pretty rapidly too. If you're interested in those reasons why, there are a lot of articles out there. We like this one from journal AWWA that was done in 2011. They talk about some of the reasons, and but that's beyond the scope of this webinar. Total water use is also declining. So even though population is increasing nationally, total water production, which is taking water from the ground or from surface water systems, treating it and delivering it to customers, that's been on decline as well since 2005, according to the data that's been collected by USGS. So that's, for a lot of systems, that's a little startling. Everybody just assumes that as population grows nationally, we'll be treating more and more water. That's not the case. We're actually treating less water and delivering less water to customers. People are just becoming much more efficient in their usage. And you see that at the local level as well, not just the national level, but all these orange dots that you see in the state of North Carolina is just an example. These are places that have seen total water use decline in the last few years. So what are the impacts to the finances of declining populations and declining demand? Let's talk about where your finances, what your revenues come from. Most of your revenues, or a lot of the revenues, come from retail customer sales. That's your monthly water bill, and it might be water and wastewater bill that you send out to your customers directly, or if you have wholesale customers, if you're treating water and selling it to a neighboring town or a neighboring system, wholesale customer sales are there. You also collect revenues from penalties, fees, anything that's a occasional one-time charge, or maybe a permanent, a one-time connection fee or system development fee. You also have sometimes revenues that are not related to water provision, and we can talk a little bit about that later on, but things like rents or leases would also come in here, or if you're accruing interest, that would be considered revenue as well. And in some circumstances, in some places in the country, in some parts of some states, you can also use taxes as a source of revenue for your water system as well. So these are the most common revenue sources for water systems. There may be some additional ones, but this is the most common. And the top two, the retail customer sales and wholesale customer sales, typically generate the vast majority of revenues for water systems that at least charge directly or charge customers directly for consumption of water. So retail customer sales and wholesale customer sales are generally charged in this fashion, where you have a fixed component, fixed base charge, as well as a variable or volumetric charge, sometimes called commodity charge. So for example, if you're charging a residential customer $30 a month plus $7 per 1,000 gallons above zero, we're talking about the $30 being the fixed charge or the base charge, and the $7 per 1,000 being the volumetric. This is going to be important because we're going to be talking a little bit about fixed revenues and variable revenues. From what you see here, the customer who's paying their bill, if they drop their consumption down to zero, or if they adjust their consumption anyway, that $30 a month does not change in any way. So that's your fixed revenue. That comes in just by the fact that you have an active customer or a customer that's connected and they haven't disconnected their account. So you've got fixed revenues coming in from your retail sales, as well as volumetric revenues that are coming in from your commodity charges or your volumetric charges. The proportions of the variable revenue that you're getting versus the fixed revenue that you're getting from these charges varies from utility to utility. Generally, what we're noticing is that if you're treating your own water and you're delivering your own water, so you're not a purchase system, but you're treating your own water, what we're noticing is that a lot of times the fixed charges account for something like 20 to 30% of the revenues, and a lot of times the majority of the retail sales, 70% or so, comes from the variable charges, the commodity charges. That's not always the case. We might see sometimes utilities have a really high base charge and low volumetric rates, and they might see that 50% of the revenues comes from that base charge. So it really varies from utility to utility. But here you're seeing two examples from 2014, and these are not small systems. These are other systems that we looked at. But you can see that there's a difference between utility 1 and utility 2, where in the first utility, a bigger portion of the customer sales, a smaller proportion of the customer sales comes from commodity charges. Utility 2, nearly all of the customer sales comes from that commodity charge. Their fixed portion is very limited. So the impact that we're talking about here, if customers are reducing their demand, the first thing that gets cut from your revenues are those variable revenues, or the charges that you're getting from your commodity charges or your volumetric charges. And that's what we need to assess in order to know how vulnerable your total finances are from decreasing demand, at least. When you're reducing your number of customers, if you're losing customers, then you're hitting both. You're hitting the fixed revenues as well as your volumetric revenues. So the total customer sales decreases. Going back to this example of the first utility you see on this graph, nearly all of their revenues, nearly 98% of the revenues, comes from customer sales. They only get 2% or so from penalties and one-time charges. If 98% of the revenues comes from customer sales, and if they're seeing a decrease in the number of population, then they're losing all their or a big portion of their customer sales. That's what's being that's what's vulnerable. That's what will be affected. As opposed to utility 2, where they have a lot of revenues coming in that's outside of customer sales, that might be protected, or might be something that's outside of how many customers that they're serving. So just to repeat, the revenue exposure that you see to declines, if your water use is declining, then the revenues that you're getting from volumetric rates are decreasing. If you're seeing a decline in number of customers, then the revenues from your fixed monthly charges are declining, as well as most likely the water use as well. So in that case, you're hitting both 1 and 2 at the same time. Okay, well, what about cost? If you have fewer customers or fewer demand and you're not treating as much water, won't costs also go down? And the answer is yes, but let's take a look at what that looks like. Here again, we have two utilities, and we're showing in black what the proportion of the revenues that are coming in from the fixed charges, from the base charge. So utility 1, it's less than 20%, and utility 2, or utility 1, something like 15%, and utility 2 is close to 17%. Of the revenues that are coming in from customer sales comes from a base charge. That means the remainder is coming from the variable charges. Looking at the expenses, as customers use less water, you'll be treating less water, your costs will go down. Well, how much of your O&M expenses will go down because you're treating less water? In the case of expenses, it's the opposite. The vast majority of the expenses that you have at utility are fixed costs. These are things that won't be affected by how much water you're actually treating. So the things that will go down immediately will be the cost of chemicals, the cost of power, and if you're purchasing water, that will also go down. The cost of purchasing that amount will go down too. But in general, if you're treating your own water, your O&M costs are mostly fixed. Your salaries, your debt service, all of your insurance, what you're paying on an annual basis, those things are not really tied to the consumption amount or how much water you're producing and delivering. So if we see your customers reducing their demand, this light gray area on the revenue side will be hit significantly, but then this small light gray area from the expensive sides will be hit. So what we end up seeing is that customers reduce their demand, revenues will go down significantly more than your costs will go down. And that creates a budget shortfall for you, or revenue difficulties for you. But how much? How much would your revenues go down based on a decline in consumption? And again, every utility has a different customer class and different number of customers, how much water they're using, different rates that you're charging, and how much of the rates come from the fixed charge versus variable charge. So it really varies from utility to utility. But there is a tool that's available that we use to help assess for some utilities what the revenue vulnerability is to reductions in demand. And this is just to show you an example from 3 different utilities across the country. We looked at what happens if the average demand drops by 15% in these 3 communities. And the answer was, it's very, very different. It really does depend on each utility. In the first case, in the southeastern coastal utility, if average demand drops by 15%, they would see a 7 to 8% reduction in their revenues. The mountain resort utility would actually see close to 25% reduction, and we can talk about how that's the case, but we won't get into that right now. And the urban utility would see something close to 13 to 14%. So it really varies from utility to utility, and again, it's something that needs to be assessed looking at your billing records directly. And we're happy to do that as part of our direct assistance to the small water systems directly. Looking at that example utility that I showed earlier about that we worked with that had a declining population since 2002, they had declining population, and at the same time, they also had a declining average water use. So both of those 2 things hit their revenue stream. Their last rate increase was in 2005, and you can see that since then, their total revenues on water has declined over time. And as you know, revenues might go down, but costs don't go down, at least not because of the consumption, but also just overall O&M costs keep rising year in and year out. One other aspect of declining populations and declining demands that we need to talk about and acknowledge is instead of just talking about the slow decline of population, there are also sudden and significant decreases when a large customer, like an industrial customer or a large commercial customer that happens to be in your town, if they shut down or if they leave, then all of a sudden you will lose a significant portion of your revenues because they account for a significant amount of the demands that are being placed on your system. In North Carolina, we asked about, I think it was about 200 systems here, if they could assess their top 5 customers, their largest 5 customers that not are wholesale, but just retail customers, how much revenue do they generate from their top 5? And you can see that even though the vast majority say the top 5 customers generate less than 10% of revenues, there are 10% of the utilities here that said those 5 customers account for more than a quarter of our revenues. So if any one of those 5 customers leaves town, we could lose a substantial amount of our revenues just overnight. And I'd like to actually ask you all, we have a poll question here, to do that kind of assessment right now. So think about your revenues, think about your customers. In your top 5 customers, if your top 5 customers leave, how much of your revenues, as far as total water bills, how much of that might go down? And if you're with a state agency or a consulting firm or a technical assistance provider, I guess you probably have to select not applicable, or you can think about systems that you work with, and typically, how do these systems, how would they answer this question? So we'll give you a second here to kind of put the answers together.
It looks like almost everyone has submitted a response. I think we can just leave it open for maybe 5 more seconds.
Okay.
I know it's kind of a little more thinking than we're normally used to at lunchtime, but we'll get this poll closed in 3, 2, and 1. And as far as the results go, of the people that responded that the question was applicable to, the majority of them, 23%, said that less than 10% of the total water bills. Right. Okay. 16% said more than 10% of the total water bills. 9% were not sure or found it hard to approximate. And then again, we saw 50% with the not applicable response. Okay.
Thank you. So we can switch back to the slides. Thank you very much, Tess. So that's, the majority, again, similar to North Carolina, the majority see that those 5 customers generate fewer than or less than 10% of total water bills, which is, in your case, that's a good thing when we're talking about the potential loss of revenues if those 5 customers leave. But there's a significant amount, I think it was 16%, said that more than 10% of your water revenues come from those 5 customers. So you might be concerned about what happens if this customer leaves town. And we'll talk about ways to address that or mitigate that coming up soon. So we appreciate that. And Tess is absolutely right. This might be very difficult to kind of think about and answer, but this is one of those things that we hope that utility managers, if they don't already have an answer for it, then they would go back and find out, because it's important information to know about your customer base and what their financial management, what your vulnerabilities are for your system as well. So if you don't have an answer, it's a good thing to kind of go back and see if you can get that from your billing records. So thank you all for doing that. Now we can talk about mitigation strategies. So we've talked about the extent of the problem. There's a lot of small towns in particular that are seeing declining in population, and we're also seeing overall decline in average water use as well as decline in total water use, especially for a lot of systems. And those declines will affect significant portions of your revenue, but will not significantly reduce your costs, at least in the short term. How do you address those things? And we'll talk about financial strategies, and then we'll talk about other types of strategies, managerial and structural type strategies as well. I mentioned earlier that I'll be talking about a lot of strategies, but not really in depth in any of them. I'm going to show you kind of what we're talking about for the financial strategies, and we'll go a little bit into each one of them. So when we're seeing reductions in revenues, one of the strategies is to find ways to reduce your costs. And that doesn't mean delaying projects or offsetting things and just pushing things off because you don't have revenues right now to pay for them. If something's important to invest in or to fix or to put your money in, you need to find a way to pay for that. But what I'm talking about is finding methods to manage your costs, both in the operation side as well as your capital expenditures. So managing O&M costs and managing your capital expenditures, but not necessarily pushing off things in such a way that it affects your overall sustainability of your services. The most common way that we see systems try to deal with this issue is through reserves, building up reserves in order to offset changes in revenues, at least in the short term. Reserves are a good way to deal with short-term problems, but you'll need to build up those reserves in order to provide a longer-term solution. If revenues are going down, one option is to find other ways to increase your revenue, and we'll talk about how you can enhance your revenues. There are some methods that you can use to adjust your rates and your rate structures in order to make them more resilient against changes in demand in particular, both in the traditional kind of rate structures and rate adjustment, how often you raise your rates, as well as there are alternative rate structure designs out there that might be beneficial to some systems. And then the last thing we'll talk about is using financial performance metrics and targets to kind of keep track of where things stand. So the strategy on reduction and management of operating costs, there are many ways you can do this, and a lot of you are doing this day in, day out, so I don't need to be preaching to you all how to do this, how to do your jobs. You know how to do them, but I'll just summarize some examples and some ways that might provide a good bang for the buck, essentially, when you're trying to reduce your costs in such a way that it doesn't affect your overall service provision as well. And the first thing is to kind of look at your water loss or your non-revenue water and try to get a handle of that. We know a lot of systems have 20, 30, 40%. We've seen some systems with 50 to 60% non-revenue water. The smaller that number, the more revenue you're generating, even if you're selling less water. So limit the leaks that you're having, as well as the easiest fix really is to look for what you're not charging for. So if you're not charging government buildings for their water use, or if you're not charging fire, or if you have faulty meters, or if some meters are just haven't been changed in a long time, there are some ways to try to address and reduce your non-revenue water. And we do direct assistance on water loss reduction, as well as I think we've done some webinars on this topic, so I won't go too deep into this one. The other strategy is to use asset management. And we do a lot of asset management planning and helping systems with asset management plans. Asset management in this setting really is helpful because it helps maximize the life of your assets and help you prioritize and where you need to spend your money. So if your costs, if your revenues are going down because demands are going down, then if you're doing asset management, you'll be able to identify which areas of town you're seeing that your population is still there and that those assets need to be addressed or need to be fixed, as opposed to just spending your money on any water leaks that's happening and just hoping that you're hitting as much as you can with whatever revenue you've got available. Having some sort of a plan, asset management plan, will help you prioritize and spend your money first on the places that will give you the biggest return on your investment when you're protecting your water system. Partnerships with other water systems, this really encompasses both financial and non-financial strategies, but on the financial side, there are ways to reduce your costs by working with other systems. Maybe you can purchase equipment and chemicals together, looking for bulk rates, or you could be sharing equipment instead of every water system having their own equipment. You could also look for ways to reduce costs by training one another or sharing contract labor as well. So we know a lot of small systems like to contract out operators who would be working on multiple systems at the same time. Energy management is also one way to reduce your costs for operations and maintenance. And to do that, again, we have webinars focused on energy management, but to do that, looking for ways to adjust your process, adjust the timing of your operations. If you're paying for your energy usage based on time of use, then adjusting when you might be operating your systems or your pumps would be one way to manage your energy costs as well. And there's an energy portfolio manager. That's a tool that's out there that's designed to help you identify ways to manage your energy usage. So look for ways to reduce your energy consumption. Another way to look for opportunities to reduce and manage your operating costs is to measure it. You've got to start by looking at trends, looking at what your costs are, and not just comparing what your expenditures are this year against what you had on your budget, although that is the starting point, but looking also in the past 5 years. How have various costs gone up? How is maintenance? What those expenditures look like? And if you're seeing a general increase in some of the line items on your expenses, or if you're seeing spikes, then it gives you an opportunity to consider those costs and to think about ways that you might be able to manage those costs. So was the general increase because of something that's happening? For example, would asset management planning and would investing in new infrastructure help reduce some of those rising costs on maintenance? Or are they some things that are just inevitable, like salaries are going up and you know, it's not going to be affected so much by what you're trying to do here? So tracking and monitoring, you need to measure what you need to try to control going forward. On the management of capital expenditures, we've got several things that we can look at. The first thing I would advise is, if you've been thinking about expanding your water system, I think that you might want to consider that again, or at least just re-examine the analysis, just to make sure that you're not going to be expanding a system assuming that there's a population increase or assuming that there's a total water demand increase, whereas the data that you're seeing from your trends is actually showing a different story. So I would advise to be cautious of doing any expansions until you're absolutely sure that, yes, the trends are showing increases in population, or that you know for sure that you're developing a new area and you need to be expanding your system in order to serve new communities. That's a different situation. But doing expansions just because you can or because you have access to funding, I would say just be careful of that, because then you're stuck with a lot of capacity that you might be not using if your customers are leaving town or if your demand is decreasing as well. So that's the first step. For capital expenditures, really you need to have a capital plan. And again, capital improvement planning is something that we always talk about. So I'm not going to go in details about it, but if you have a capital plan, then at least you're able to prioritize and to identify ways to control your costs, grouping different capital projects together, planning it with coinciding with other things. If you know that there are going to be street repairs happening down Main Street, maybe try to bring and you need to be investing in a new water line or replacing the water line that's under Main Street. Try to coincide those two projects together so that you're managing costs and reducing your costs as well as inconvenience for your customers. But having a capital plan is always a solid way of reducing your overall long-term capital costs, because at least you have a way to manage those costs and to be more strategic about looking for funding and how you're going to pay for those costs. So speaking of how do you pay for them, the variance or the using debt versus cash gives you an opportunity to try to manage your costs as well. So instead of trying to do everything using cash and spending a lot of cash on capital investments, sometimes looking at debt or looking at SRF programs or looking at USDA to look for loans helps spread out some of those costs over time, and that will be a way to manage your capital expenditures as well. When you're looking at capital expenses, I would suggest also looking at funding scenarios and not just kind of going in assuming that, all right, I'm going to be getting a $100,000 grant here and everything else will be spent using cash, but try out different scenarios, because then you can assess how different funding strategies might affect long-term costs as well as short-term costs for your customers. And we have a tool, and I'll show you, actually it's right here. We have a tool that's available for people to download called Plan to Pay, where you would put in your capital projects, put in the costs for all those projects, and then you can select whether you're going to be using cash or using debt service or grants to pay for those projects, and it will automatically assess what the rate increases need to be in order to pay for all of these capital projects. And if something doesn't look like it's financially feasible for you, then you can change your scenarios and think about either changing your capital plan or changing the way that you're planning to pay for those capital projects in a way to make your rate increases feasible for your community as well. So that tool is available, and we've helped a lot of systems directly using this tool. But looking for different funding scenarios is one way to try to manage your costs as well. And then debt refinancing. Some places have debts that they've taken on 5, 10, 15 years ago, and interest rates might have gone down significantly enough that if you're able to refinance, either through the program that you already have or by if you have bonds, going after new bonds to refinance old ones, that might be one way to try to reduce your debt service costs as well. For those larger systems on the call, if you have a credit rating, obviously trying to identify how to get a better or higher credit rating will help you reduce your interest rates going forward as well. There's very few small systems out there that are trying to go after credit ratings, but it is a mechanism available for those systems that are looking for bonds to get good ratings in order to reduce their expenses on bonds. And then partnering with other utilities on regional projects. So instead of doing a project for your system alone, if you're looking for ways to reduce your capital expenditures, look to your neighboring systems and see if there are ways that you can do regional projects or to do or combine your 2 or 3 different systems projects together in a way that you can create a regional project that you can apply to SRF loans or USDA, because a lot of times you might get favorable rates or favorable evaluations when you're applying for these competitive loan programs. Reserves, again, are important, and the main thing there is that you need to be building up your reserves before you see signs of problems. So the reserves are funds that you've built up over time that you can use for any purpose. Everybody's got reserves unless you're in the private sector, but if you're in the public sector, you've got your reserves. Whatever is in your fund balance at the end of the fiscal year is essentially kind of what you're using a reserve if you don't have a separate reserve fund as well. but you need to be building up your reserves. They're a good way to reduce your short-term vulnerability to reductions in demand. So if this year you're selling less water than you expected because population decreased or water use decreased, then you've got something in your reserve to be able to accommodate your expenses and to be able to pay for those expenses that your revenues are falling short of. But that's only going to help you for 1 year, 2 years. It's not going to be a long-term fix unless you're building up those reserves. And if you're already suffering from customer losses or water use losses, it might be a little too late to try to build up those reserves unless you're willing to do a significant rate increase immediately. We do a lot of trainings. We talk about reserves in those trainings. There are different types of reserve funds out there. Most common for small systems, you don't have a separate reserve fund. It's just whatever you have available is unrestricted cash. That's kind of considered your reserve, or it's operating reserves. But some places would like to create, or they do create, separate reserve funds, and they put money into those funds and just use them only for a specific purpose. So you can have repair funds or emergency funds. You put money in there and you have it available for when you need to do repairs or if you need it for emergencies. So it keeps it separate from your overall operating funds, and you'll know how much you have available, and you could be more intentional about how much you put into those funds to be prepared for costs that you might not be able to pay for under reductions in revenues. And then you have other types, rainy day funds or revenue shortfall funds. So some systems like to have that fund for those years in where the revenues are lower than they expected. Then they can dip into those rainy day funds or rate stabilization reserves in order to prevent having to raise rates immediately after a revenue shortfall, at least for 1 year. But the key here again is that you have to keep funding those reserves and to maintain them at a level that will be sufficient to keep your operations going. So how much you need to put in your reserves? I hate to say that it depends, but it depends. It really depends on what you want to be doing with those reserves. In this case of reserves specifically to deal with declining demands and declining revenues from declining demands, you need to have enough in your reserve fund to be able to pay for your operations and maintenance, to be able to pay for your planned expenditures, including your capital expenditures, in the short term without having to borrow funds from the general fund or some other mechanism as well. So you have enough revenues in there to pay for, or enough funds in your reserves to pay for the things that your revenue shortfall is not going to cover. As a rule of thumb, that is something that your board or your council should decide. But I would recommend at least 3 to 4 months of O&M expenses would be kind of reserved in a separate reserve fund. And that's, to me, that's a minimum. I think that a lot of systems aim for higher, and I would recommend aiming for higher than that. A lot of systems look for, if you see this example, you might see 90 days or 3 months, you might see 33% of 1 year's budget, which is 4 months. But there are some utilities, for example, Charlotte Water back a few years ago has a target of 100%. So they put enough reserves to fund a year's worth of expenditures without having to dip into their revenues. And here's an example from a small system as well. So Town of Charlotte, North Carolina said that their aldermen decided to have a reserve that's a 90%. So they need to keep at least 90% of their current budget on hand in case of emergencies. And the reason for it is because they acknowledge that any hurricane can do significant damage. So they need to have a significant amount of money available to pay for repairs or to pay for, if customers leave town because of the hurricane and they don't come back, then you have enough revenue to keep your system going until you manage your costs in the long term. On the revenue enhancement, you can raise rates and fees, which is the most common way of doing of raising revenues. You can look for ways to sell water to your neighboring systems as well, especially if you have excess capacity. And then you can generate new revenues as well. And generating new revenues means looking for ways to rent out space for use or for advertising use, meaning you can rent out your meeting rooms for communities to use for their own function, or you can use your water towers for billboards, or you can lease your water towers for cell phone antennas. So there are ways to generate new revenues, new sources of revenue for the water system. That's not related to actually provision of water, but it's a good source of potential revenue for your system as well. And there's a report from the Water Research Foundation that talks about different, different sources of revenue. I won't get too much into it, but if you're interested in that, please let me know. I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about that. Rate adjustment approaches. Every system knows that you need to raise rates as much as you need to, as often as you need to, but sometimes that might be politically difficult to get rate increases approved. And if that's the case, there are some mechanisms that are helpful that would not bypass the process, but at least will help fast forward the process. So you could have your council agree that if you're a purchased water system, you can have pass-through charges. So if your wholesale provider is selling you water and then they raise rates, you have a process in place that will automatically raise your rates on your customers by the same amount, or there's a little bit more than that. So that way you don't need to have another rate, the rate presentation to your board and to wait for the board to approve it, but you have that an automatic rate increase. You could also look to do multi-year rate increases as opposed to presenting once a year and trying to ask for a rate increase every single year. And having that multi-year rate increase approved once might be beneficial and easier going forward for some systems. There's also ways that you can index your rates to inflation rates. And if you do that, I would recommend the CCI, the Construction Cost Index. These are not ideal, but they're at least a good way to make sure that your rates are going up at least a little bit amount every single year without having to go through the process of justifying another rate increase to your board. Adjusting your rate structure design. The first thing is that you could look at your fixed revenues versus your variable revenues. And if your average water use is declining, but your customers are not, then you could think about switching more of the revenue generation on your base charge. So that way you're generating more from the number of customers that you have as opposed to the volume of water that you're selling. Of course, there are pros and cons with all of this. If you do that, then you're reducing that incentive for customers to be more conservative or more efficient in their water use. So we can talk a little bit about that. We've done presentations essentially just talking only about this one particular point. But one strategy is, if you're trying to make your revenues more resilient, put more on the revenue generation on the fixed charges as opposed to the volumetric charges, knowing that there are some cons with that as well. If you are losing customers, then we're talking about having to raise your rates across the board, including the base charges. So again, the base charges play a really critical role in the revenue vulnerability of your system here. And then consider alternative rates that also don't depend so much on revenues from high volumes or high block sales. So if you have an increasing block rate structure and you're trying to generate 25% of your revenues from your highest tier, I would recommend, if you're trying to be more resilient, put more of the revenue generation focus on the lower tiers as well and shift it away from the high, because if customers start reducing their consumption from those high tiers, you will end up losing a lot more of your revenue, proportionally more of that revenue coming from those high tiers. So shifting your rate structure so that more of the revenues are coming from your lower base charges. And there are also alternative rate structure designs, innovative rate structure designs that are not the common base charge plus volumetric that might be helpful for some systems as well. And if you're interested to know about innovative rate structures, once you get the PowerPoint slides, you can go to this YouTube video and watch, I think we present on 3 different types, and we analyzed it, and we showed that there are some rate structure, innovative rate structure designs that are out there that would generate a lot more fixed revenue for your utility, and at the same time still incentivize your customers to reduce their consumption. So if that's something that sounds appealing to you, take a look at the YouTube video and then contact me for more information. And then setting up internal financial performance metrics, that's not really a strategy to mitigate but it's something that you need to do in order to evaluate and to make sure that you know where you might be hurting when revenues decline because of decreasing usage. And if you're interested to know a little bit more about financial targets, what those look like, what kind of targets you can put, how do you assess them, where do you get the information from them. We did a webinar specifically on this. And again, with the PowerPoint slide, you can then click on this link and watch that 1-hour webinar. And these are some examples of what those financial targets would look like. These are all things that you can calculate easily from your financial statements, as well as some supplemental data that you can collect from other sources like the Census Bureau. So we talked about financial strategies. Now let's talk about other types of strategies as well. And there are 5 things that I'll try to talk about. We'll start off by talking about planning and adjusting demand forecasts, knowing your biggest customers, assisting economic development efforts, and then the main thing, really, the big one, is partnerships with other water systems, as well as a little bit on communication. So when you're doing demand forecasts, when you're looking at your water usage, and you're thinking about expansions in any way, or when you're looking at your budget for the next year, and you're trying to set rates for the next year's, what you're projecting is going to be your usage next year. Be conservative in your forecast. Don't always just assume that you will sell the same amount of water next year that you did this year, or that your usage is going up. You know, look at the trends and see where things are going, and be conservative. If you're not sure, assume that you'll be selling less water than you will be. And that way you will be trying to protect your revenues. You'll have to, charge the rates to accommodate lower usage, lower sales going forward. Run different scenarios. Don't just do a forecast, a budget forecast that's just looking at one scenario and assuming one consumption point for next year. Look at a low case and a high case scenario. If you are projecting that you're going to be selling 1 million gallons, I'm not sure it's 1 million gallons a day, but if it's 1 million gallons next year, think about, well, what happens if we lose about 10% of that next year because average use is declining. Run those different scenarios. See what the rates need to be to accommodate both a low case or a bad case versus what you're actually projecting. And that way you can communicate with your board and you can come up with a rate that would be a little bit more conservative and resilient. Look at your long-term trends to inform forecast. And that means looking at your billing records. Look for 5 to 10 years worth of billing records if you can. If not, 3 to 5 years might be helpful. And we've done that too before. So if that's something that you would want our assistance on, we're happy to do that. And then incorporate short-term and long-term reductions in demand in your projection. So again, when you're looking at your budget, assume that there's going to be a 5% or 10% reduction in your demand, if not next year, then at least over the next few years as well. So be proactive in assuming that there's going to be a reduction. Or if you know that you're growing and your total usage is going up, then be more conservative in assuming that the growth is going to be slower than you normally would project. And then establish a policy where you move anything that's an excess revenue into a reserve fund or into some kind of a plan to how you're going to spend that money. So by being conservative, you run that opportunity where you might generate more revenue next year than you actually need. And if that's the case, then have a plan for what you're going to use that revenue for. You can't just sit on it. You can have a protocol to move that into a reserve fund with a purpose for spending that money on whatever it is, capital projects, or that you're building up reserves for other years where revenues might fall short as well. We have tools available to help systems look at what the rates need to be in order to pay for your expenses going forward, and that includes and incorporates usage projections. We're happy to use that with you and work with you one-on-one to project what your revenues are and to run different scenarios as well. Know your biggest customers. So a lot of you mentioned that you have about 10% of your revenues come from your 5 largest customers. If they're commercial customers or if they're industrial customers, I think that it's really important to get to know who they are. And that actually means going and meeting with them. Find out, take a tour of the facilities, find out how they use your water, build up customer service, find out what you could do to provide reliable water service to keep them in town. and to build that rapport so that if they're thinking about leaving town, you can at least get a heads up about it and start planning for it ahead of time. Or to be able to mitigate against it. If they're leaving town because they can't get the volumes of water they need, then you can try to plan around providing a solution there, as opposed to them just leaving without letting you know that was the reason why. So meet with your largest customers, tour the facilities, build that relationship with your customers. And then assist with economic development efforts as well. We're talking about loss of customers. Well, there might be opportunities to bring in new customers, especially large customers as well. So work with your area development district, work with your county, work with the Chamber of Commerce, talk to your elected officials and to the planners in your towns or in your regions. Let them know if you have excess water capacity and how much you could provide. They need to be aware of the fact that you've got that excess and where you could serve, so that they can go out there and try to bring in new customers or attract new customers to your community. And look for ways to adjust your rate structures to incentivize business development, but be cautious, check and see whether those things are legal in your state or not. Some systems, for example, have waived connection fees for new customers that are coming in, or commercial customers or large water users, essentially. So it's one way to attract customers to your area. Another example is from a town that was charging discounts on usage, on high usage as well, or to charge different rate structures for non-residential customers compared to residential customers. And typically, if you charge separate rates for non-residential customers, you end up charging lower rates anyway because of the volumes that they purchase. If you have decreasing blocks, I would, or you can use decreasing blocks as a way to charge lower rates for high consumptions, but only do that for really high volumes of water as well. So, for example, this one was charging $3.75 per thousand up to 1 million gallons a month. Anything above 1 million gallons a month, they're only charging 30 cents per thousand. So some ways to attract really high water using customers to the area. I'm going to skip this one. For partnerships, there are multiple ways that you can provide partners, or they can work with water systems and other partners in your area. You can share services, you can sell excess. We talked about this one to other water systems, or you can buy from another system too. So sometimes if you're losing a lot of customers, in some cases, it stops making sense for you to have your own treatment system and to be investing so much in your treatment system if you can be purchasing water from a neighboring town at a lower overall rate. So there are some opportunities for some systems to look at purchasing water and shutting down, or at least mothballing a little bit the treatment facilities as a way to reduce costs in the long term. Consolidation is one way as well. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. So with sharing services, we're talking about bulk purchase agreements on equipment or chemicals. You can be sharing staff or sharing contractors. You can also be thinking about ways to share management. So you could have you can contract out finance officers, for example. You can look at ways that you can have multiple small systems nearby, use the same management team to manage all systems. With remote monitoring technologies, operations and management really can happen now more regionally as opposed to having to be done locally. If you're looking to do interconnections to buy water or sell water, I know one of the things that is a big concern is interlocal agreements. And we have a guidance document out there for systems that are looking to do interlocal agreements, and what kind of questions you should be asking, what kind of things you should be negotiating as well. So this guidance document is available for you to use. And if you're looking to consolidate and to create a regional water system, as opposed to having multiple small systems nearby one another, you can look at ways to create different types of institutional models. There are different types of regional systems out there, and it's a difficult process to get started. Again, it's a lot of there's a lot of questions like, what does it look like? How do we do this? And we have a separate guidance document that addresses those questions. So this guidance document gives you ideas about what you need to consider if you're thinking about consolidating water systems. And then the last thing on that spectrum of partnerships is transfer of ownership, is to essentially give up your water system, give it to another town, or give it to a private industry as well. And these things, that for a lot of small systems are seeing long-term declines in population, that becomes really their only option, especially if they're not near other systems, is to sell their system or to give it to the county or to give it to another larger town nearby, and they can run it as part of their operations as well. And we've done webinars talking about transfer of ownership as well. If that's something that you're curious about or interested in, again, let us know. We can maybe work with you on that. On the communication side, you can work with your staff or your board or your customers and try to solicit ideas about how to address your revenue shortfalls because of these decreases. And you need to understand from your customers and elected officials what their thoughts and their plans are going forward so that you can plan for 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So I'm going to end here. I'm going to skip this poll question. There are a lot of resources available. This tool that can help you assess your revenue vulnerability based on your rate structure. And again, something that we can help work with you on one-on-one. There's this report that talks about other strategies and practices available for revenue resiliency. The 2 guidance documents that I talked about earlier. And then on our website, you can go on EFCN or efcnetwork.org. You can click on resources. On the resource library, you can find a few tools that you can use yourself. You can sign up for a blog, or you can click on assistance, request assistance, and then we can then come in and help you with your water system needs and help either address or identify what your trends are going forward or what your mitigation strategies could be going forward, especially on the financial side and how your rates need to look. So I'm going to end here and ask for this poll to come up. And then for the same time, Tess, if you had any questions that have come in, I'm happy to answer those questions. But if you don't mind putting up this poll question, that would be great.
Yes, absolutely. We did get quite a few questions. I don't know if we're going to have enough time to get to all of them, but we do have a good record of them, so we'll be able to follow up with you after the webinar if you asked a question and we don't have time to get to it. I think we'll just spend do maybe 1 or 2, Shadi, just to keep us all on ending most of the time. Great, so it looks like everybody's responded to the poll, so I'm going to go ahead and close it. We also sent out a link to our evaluation, which if you choose to take it, that can help us improve our webinars. And just to get started, an attendee was interested to know, you had spent some time discussing customer expansion. What would be your best guess as to why systems tend to gravitate towards customer expansion as a strategy?
If the question is customer expansion, I mean, if it's about the system expansion as opposed to customer expansion, it might be a different answer. If it's looking for new customers, that being customer expansion, I think that's a strategy because if the more customers you have economies of scale with your cost. The more customers you have, your costs will go up, but not as much as your revenues will go up. So it's the inverse of the problem that we're talking about here. The solution to all of this is to have more and more customers. That's why we talked about using economic development strategies to try to bring in new customers to your town as well. So it's a good solution. As far as the system expansion, is what I talked about earlier, I think some systems look for, there may be some opportunities for systems to apply for grants that are available at the state level to pay for expansions, to pay for planning studies, and just the attractiveness of having that funding available and to generate, to create excess capacity that provides more, peace of mind. The fact that you have enough capacity to keep adding more and more customers to your system and still have enough water resources to support all those new customers. That's there because there's the grant incentive as well as that peace of mind that we all like. But I'll be cautious because that infrastructure that you bring in, even if you're using a grant to pay for that infrastructure and expand your system, that infrastructure is going to cost you something on operations and maintenance and on life cycle costs and on replacement going forward. So that expansion is coming in, quote unquote, for free from a grant actually cost you a lot of money down the line. And if you don't have customers to use that expansion right now, I'd be very, very cautious on the financial side to approve such a project. A good question.
And yes, the asker of the question also clarified that that as expanding customers as opposed to fixing water loss issues was also something they were thinking about when they were asking that. I do want to reiterate that a lot of people are asking about getting copies of the presentation and the links in the presentation. We will be posting this on our website as soon as we can. And the link will be emailed out to you to the same email address that you registered with as soon as we get everything processed and uploaded. And all those links should be live, so you should have no problem accessing them. And then one more question, I think we have a little, maybe just one more minute. So the question is, do you know of, or do you have a tool that shows the elasticity of demand for water prices?
We've looked at elasticity before. Elasticity meaning if you raise your rates, customers will typically respond by reducing their average usage because they want to control their bills. So when you're making projections going forward and you say next year we're going to be raising rates by 10%, you should assume that your average water use will actually decrease a little bit because of that rate increase. And you need to use that reduction in your analysis and accommodate for that in your rate increase projection. So it's kind of a little bit circular effect. But so we've looked at these analyses, and there have been studies upon studies of that. It really varies by region and by utility, and so it's hard to kind of give a good rule of thumb. In the Southeast, it's what we're seeing is the elasticity is lower than it is out west. Various reasons why that's the case. But I would say something like, if you don't already have an elasticity factored into your analysis, I would put in at least a 2% or 3%. So if you raise your rates by 10%, your average use will go down by 2% or 3%. That will be higher if your average use is high, lower if your average use is low. So if you're already close to 3,000 gallons or 4,000 gallons a month average, maybe look at 1% to 2%. But those are, I'm spitballing some of these numbers that we've seen. They really do vary utility by utility, unfortunately. So it's hard to kind of give a good rule of thumb there. Now, I apologize for going over on time. I'm definitely happy to answer you. You see my email address up here, my phone number as well. I'm happy to address questions that will come in. Tess will send me the questions that you've submitted, and I'll respond to those in the next few days. And we've got a team here who can work with you one-on-one on issues that you're dealing with at your system. So if your system serves 10,000 people or fewer, we're happy to work with you one-on-one, thanks to a cooperative agreement from EPA as well. So again, thank you all for your attention. I'm sorry that I went over on time, but we'll get to your questions offline as well.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to end on. So thanks, everyone, and have a great afternoon.